Good afternoon. Everybody had lunch? That's food coma. It's like perfect time to have a security presentation, right? So I'm Prerit Garg. I'm the general manager for Identity, Directory, and Access Services at AWS. Been doing this for 20 plus years, so we'll see how this goes. Okay, there we go. So there are about three things I want to cover today. First is I want to give you a set of real-world examples for how customers are deploying identity and access services for their use cases. And my hope by giving you a few customer examples is that if you are trying to figure out how to build your identity and access systems for your applications, hopefully these patterns can help you with ideas on how to build your particular services. So a lot of us learn through patterns, so hopefully these patterns will sort of give you some examples. Following those examples, I'll sort of walk you quickly through the various services we have. It's not intended to be a deep dive into the services. It's just to give you sort of a landscape so that when you go off the session and you want to dive into it, you have a little bit of a roadmap of figuring out, okay, which services do I want to dive in. And then in the end, I want to kind of give you a blueprint, a mental model of how you should think about these different pieces that are required to build a good identity and access solution for your applications or your infrastructure that you're deploying in AWS. A lot of times I hear, hey, there are lots of moving pieces, lots of moving parts. I don't know where to get started. So my hope is that the blueprint will give you essentially a framework that you can use as you go build your solutions. How many of folks in the room consider themselves as sort of identity and access experts? And how many of you would consider yourselves as novices in trying to figure out what you need to do? Okay. So hopefully the session is useful and gives you a place to get started. So, one of the things we say in AWS all the time is there is no compression algorithm to experience. And 11 plus years of journey building the cloud, we've learned a lot. And one of the things we've learned is that each of our customer goes through their own unique journey when they're moving to the cloud or adopting the cloud. And that's a humbling experience to watch each of our customers going and figuring out what their deployments are going to look like, what their applications are going to look like. And that has guided us in many ways of how we built our services, how we provide those APIs, how we provide security features. To give you a few examples of those, let's get started. So General Electric, one of the largest corporations in the world, is deploying in AWS. A lot of applications, their goal is to move all in on AWS. So how are they going about it? Right? Now, this is a company that's very old, hundreds of years old, and clearly they have lots of applications, they have lots of infrastructure that they already run, they have lots of data centers they already run. And so as they were thinking about moving to the cloud, one of the first things they thought about is, well, how do they build a common platform that all their teams can use as they move to the cloud? And of course, as they're thinking about that, they have a lot of existing infrastructure, and a lot of that existing infrastructure uses Active Directory. And so it was imperative for them to build their Active Directory infrastructure for identity and access pieces in the AWS Cloud. Now, they could have chosen to have deployed their own deployments of Active Directory, but they decided that that's not what they wanted to do. They did not want to manage domain controllers. They did not want to keep them patched, monitor replication. So they chose to use our managed Active Directory service to build out their identity and access infrastructure. Because with AWS Directory Service for managed Microsoft Active Directory, they can actually just simply set up a trust relationship back to their on-premises Active Directory and have essentially all of the security infrastructure they need in terms of authentication and authorizing access. And so now they can enable and start migrating workloads, building new applications, leveraging the same infrastructure that they already had. And without having to manage any of the infrastructure in the cloud, right? And then they can slowly, over time, decide to migrate off of what they have on premises. This clicker is a little slow. TIBCO, a very different example, building cloud-native applications. So a lot of their teams had organically gone and created AWS accounts, deployed AWS resources, and started building those applications. And now they were looking at how do they bring those pieces into some sort of a governance model so that they can put some guardrails around how their developers were building those applications, what security policies they wanted to configure around that, and then how do they automate a lot of these pieces so that as more teams go build new applications, they had that same framework in place. So in their case, they ended up using AWS organizations to create essentially an organization of all of their AWS accounts and set up service control policies to control what services and what APIs were available to these developers in different AWS accounts. So very different sort of situation, very different use case. And then Hixme is one of our customers. They provide employee benefits and insurance services to businesses. So they were out there wanting to build a cloud-native application for their customers, where their customers could log in and access their application and their resources and manage customer-sensitive information in their application. So as part of building their application, which included a mobile front end, they chose Amazon Cognito as their solution for identity and access. Amazon Cognito gives them an ability to have a user pool or a user directory that could scale to millions of identities. So they don't have to manage their own directory. They can just use Amazon Cognito to manage and scale their directory. Their developers don't have to think about how to secure the data. They don't have to think about security protocols. They don't have to think about how to sign in, develop sign in and sign up, because Cognito comes with built-in sign in and sign up capabilities. Not only that, they decided to build a serverless application using AWS Lambda. So as you can sort of see, very different use cases, very different scenarios, and very different sets of services getting used to build these applications and these infrastructure out. Not only that, so you see lots of variety of cases that we see with our customers. A couple of more examples I'll point out. In there, we have a customer which is a large restaurant chain, and they wanted to build out a brand new application using the cloud, which was focused on deploying IoT devices in their restaurants. And in that particular case, they decided to use Amazon Cloud Directory because they wanted to build out a repository for these IoT devices and control access to these IoT devices. So they had a very unique case, and we had just the right service for them to build out a hierarchical catalog of their IoT devices and control access to these devices. Now, and I'll give you one more, just to kind of sort of have some of these juices flowing for each of you. We have a pharmaceutical company that wanted to move to virtual desktops, and they decided to use Amazon Workspaces. They used an Active Directory connector to connect back to their on-premises Active Directory to enable single sign-on to Workspaces for their employees. So lots of different use cases and lots of different services that they take advantage of to build out identity and access for those use cases. As sort of the slide gives you a feel for it, you could be building a mobile or a web application. You might have regulatory or compliance requirements. You may be a Windows guy using Active Directory. You may be a Linux guy using LDAP. You might want to use managed services because you don't want to manage the infrastructure, or you may want to build your own infrastructure out. And at AWS, we've been very sensitive to all these different use cases. And our goal has been to provide you a set of building blocks or services that you can use to enable your use cases. So as you look at these use cases, what you find is sort of these common patterns that emerge. Applications want to authenticate users, and sometimes they want to authenticate other devices, or other code. They want to authorize access. Of course, you want to only do authentication because you want to ultimately do access control. And then you have governance and audit requirements to ensure that you're meeting the policies for your business or your vertical in the industry. So there's plethora of services that we have available for your use, right? Not only in the identity and directory space, but also a bunch of security services, cryptography services. In the hour or so that I have, 45 minutes now, I'm going to focus just on identity and directory services. There are many other sessions that are happening at the conference that you can go to dive into many of the security services, as well as our cryptographic services like KMS and Certificate Manager. So just looking at the identity, directory, and access services. So our core service in this space is IAM, Identity and Access Management Service. IAM is at the foundation of AWS in terms of providing you authentication and access to AWS resources. IAM operates at individual AWS accounts. So if you want to control access to AWS resources, the service you're going to use is AWS IAM. Then earlier this year, we added AWS organizations. What we found is as more and more customers expanded their use of AWS, they were creating many accounts for a bunch of reasons. One of the most common reasons tends to be they want to isolate different applications that they're developing. They want to isolate the teams and want to give them that decoupled approach to building out their applications. And AWS accounts give them essentially those isolated containers. But then you run into this problem. Now I have hundreds of accounts. And well, how do I centrally manage hundreds of accounts? And that's where AWS organizations helps you in terms of putting all these accounts into essentially an account directory, and then be able to set a policy on these accounts where you can say which services are available for your prod accounts versus which services can be used by your developer accounts. And you can allow developers to play in their sandboxes while building applications, but be much more stringent about what they can do in the production accounts. And then we have AWS Directory Service, which is essentially a bridge, which gives you a bridge to migrate your Active Directory-based workloads, because it offers you a managed Active Directory that you can set up as a resource domain that sets up trust relationship back to your on-premises Active Directory, or you can set it up as a primary domain in AWS and manage your users right in AWS Cloud. If you have Windows-based workloads or you have Microsoft-based workloads, you get a full Active Directory capability with that. And it scales to as many domain controllers so that you can actually have use cases fully running in AWS Cloud. Then we have Amazon Cognito. If you're building a cloud-native application, particularly facing customers where you want to allow customers to sign up, authenticate, and get access to your application use cases, Amazon Cognito is our service that gives you many features. It gives you a user directory that can scale to millions of identities. So you don't have to manage it. It takes care of securing the data on disk. It takes care of appropriate authentication protocols, sign-up experiences. And then it also enables you to federate social identities like Facebook and Twitter and so on. So if you're building a customer-facing application, Amazon Cognito is something that you should look at. And then finally, we have Amazon Cloud Directory, which is also a service we launched earlier this year. And it is our general-purpose directory service where if none of the other services meet your needs and you need to build a directory for your use cases, for example, the IoT use case I talked about, where the customer has to store hierarchical data that is specific to their application and needs to do access control and management and policies with that, then you can use the Amazon Cloud Directory and build your application out from ground up. In fact, Amazon Cloud Directory is the foundation that many of our own services take advantage of as well. Yeah. Okay, so let me actually go back quickly. So earlier, just to give you a little bit of feel for, as you probably already know, we constantly iterate on our services. I want to give you a couple of examples of things that we've recently launched, so you have an idea. In the context of AWS IAM, we recently launched our visual point-and-click editor. So if you're writing IAM policies and trying to figure out how to write JSON, well, you don't have to anymore. You can use our point-and-click editor, which makes it super easy for you to create an IAM policy just for your use cases. I see some nodding heads, so it looks like some of the folks have played with it. In the context of AWS Directory Service, we launched our Microsoft Managed Active Directory Standard Edition. We had an Enterprise Edition, which was 40 cents a domain an hour, and we've just launched the version that is scaled down for SMB scenarios and resource domain scenarios, and it's at 12 cents for 2 domain controllers, and then you can add as many domain controllers as you want. And that also, we've seen many customers immediately take advantage of. So building on that, these launches, oops, I'm going backwards. So I'm super excited to announce some capabilities we are adding to our Amazon Cognito offering. So these will be available later today, so you can actually go play with them. There are 3 features we're launching as part of Amazon Cognito. One is we're enabling a risk-based authentication capability, so in which Cognito will analyze things like location, IP address, time of day, multiple logins, various contextual parameters as the logins are happening to your application to determine a risk score. And then you can control at what risk score you want additional authentication to be required from the users. So if you're building highly sensitive applications and you want additional controls over how much friction that the user has to face during authentication, you can take advantage of our risk-based authentication capability. As you can imagine, Amazon has been in the business for 20 plus years serving consumers. So over the years, we've actually built a lot of insight, gathering data across the internet about compromised accounts on our consumer services side. And with Amazon Cognito today, we're offering some of that capability back to you for your applications, where we are getting that data stream about compromised user credentials, and we're going to take advantage of that. So if you're building your application using Cognito, we will use that information. So if those accounts are compromised and those customers are using your applications, we will protect them from your applications getting compromised with those credentials. So we're taking all that data stream that we are getting from the internet about compromised accounts, and we're making that available to you for your applications. And finally, we are adding additional authentication factors. So we're adding support for one-time password-based tokens like Google Authenticator as well as Authy. So if you're building applications and you want your users to have multiple authentication factors, now Cognito enables you to do that as well. So as you look at our services, one of the things I often get this question is, it's like, how do we think about our goals for the services we provide to our customers? And this is important because I think what you'll see is that it'll give you the framework of how we think about our services as we make them available to you. And then when we talk about the blueprint, you can apply some of these ideas. So we really have 3 fundamental goals when we are trying to build our services. The first goal we have is that we want to provide you security that is better than you can get anywhere else, right? On premises, in other places, right? Or you could have done it yourself. The second is, as I said earlier, we've seen over and over again that customers have very unique needs. So we want to build services that are flexible, that meet our customers where they are in terms of solving the problems they need to solve, rather than trying to get our customers to adapt to us. We want to adapt to our customer needs. And finally, We want our services to be comprehensive so that you can get started quickly, but then as you scale and your use cases get more sophisticated, we have the capabilities to meet those sophisticated needs. So let's dig into each of these goals a little bit in the context of our services and ask the question, how are we actually delivering against these goals? So the first one is sort of this notion of giving you better security than you could have gotten anywhere else. I used to have a colleague 20 years ago, and he used to say that all security starts in the back alley with two people in black jackets exchanging a secret. Right? And so a lot of security boils down to credentials. Right? Security starts with exchanging of a secret, and those secrets become the most valuable foundation to how you build the security systems. So it's very important to think about how do we secure these credentials if you're going to give you better security. So, and then when you think about these credentials, there are two types of credentials that most of times we run into. One are credentials that are controlled by humans, so things like passwords or MFA factors. And then there are credentials that are typically associated with network services. Right? Over the years, we've gotten better and better with user credentials, though I still think that passwords are the weakest link, but at least we've added multiple factors, we've started doing risk analysis, so we've gotten better around protecting user credentials. One of the areas that has severely lacked, if you were back 10 years ago building network services, you would be forced to embed credentials, right? Like, I don't know how many times we found credentials getting compromised because somebody's embedded a password or an access key right in their code, right? We still find embarrassed situations where people have them actually checked into GitHub. With AWS, we took a major step with providing short-term credentials. It was our fundamental goal that you never have to embed credentials for your code, right? And so if you are doing that today, I highly encourage you to look at IAM roles, which automatically issue short-term credentials to your code running on EC2 instances, Lambda functions, containers, right? And you don't have to embed credentials in your code. The credentials are rotated every hour, and so you definitely won't want to get embarrassed with having long-term credentials found in your source code. So that's one area where we've taken major strides. Another example is kind of providing you multi-factor authentication as well as single sign-on capability, so you can use your corporate credentials and the policies and protections you already have in place with respect to human credentials with single sign-on. Then there's protection using data encryption, right? Cryptography. So data at rest or data in transit. So we have cryptographic services that enable you to protect data both at rest and in the cloud. Then we want to enable you to build secure applications of your own. So providing things like Cognito about giving you a scalable, secure store where you don't have to think about how to secure the credentials of your users or how you secure authentication protocols, where you can just use the capabilities right off and your developers don't have to figure out a lot of the intricacies of cryptography or authentication protocols. You can take advantage of those services. Another area we've kind of innovated is around access control. IAM policies are probably the most granular access control policies you would find anywhere. They're not just the read-write permissions. You can, on a per API basis, control who is allowed to call which API. Not only that, you can also contextualize the APIs and say which IP address they can call from. Does the MFA get required? At what time of day you can call these APIs. So you get a lot of granularity and control over which APIs are allowed and by whom and to whom. And lastly, right, with organizations, we're now giving you controls over how you manage access across many different accounts as well, so that you can have governance and audit. You can meet those governance and audit requirements. In terms of flexibility, as I said earlier, We want to meet you where you are. We want to meet you. We want to give you choices that actually deliver on the services that you are trying to build. So we want to give you choice on identity. We don't have a strong view that you should use IAM identities. We want to enable you, if you already have a corporate directory and you already have your own corporate policies, we want you to enable you to federate those identities into AWS. In terms of directories, you can use Active Directory, you can use IAM, you can use Cognito, you can use Cloud Directory and build your own solution. So we give you choices depending on your use case and the problem you're trying to solve. In terms of federating itself, we give you choices. You can do SAML-based federation, or you can just set up Kerberos Trust with Active Directory running in AWS with your Active Directory running on premises. You can run our managed offerings like Cloud Directory or Cognito or Managed Active Directory, or you can build your own solution on top of EC2. And finally, the services being comprehensive. We do want to enable you to get started quickly. And, one of the challenges with providing comprehensive services is there are too many knobs and there are too many options. And that can be a fairly overwhelming experience if you're getting started with a lot of these capabilities. So one of the things we've done over the last few years is we want to provide you templates. We want to provide you managed policies right off the box for different job functions like database administrator, so you don't have to figure out what policy to grant. So you can just use the canned policies that are available. And like I told you, we recently launched the Visual Editor. And with Visual Editor, you can craft your policy with simple point-and-click experience. So you can start doing customizations slowly based on your need. And then you can go as deep as you want and get all of the richness, the more expert and the more fine-grained your needs become. So that's one area of sort of giving you that entire spectrum, starting quickly with simple things, and then be able to expand and grow in the cloud and get all the sophistication you need. Another example of that you can sort of see there is sort of visibility into who has access to what. We have capabilities both with IAM as well as with CloudRail. You can actually see who accessed what capability. And you can go into the IAM console, and it'll show you who was the user that last accessed which API. And you get all of that information right in the console. OK. At this point, I want to kind of switch gears. I want to dive into a mental model I want to give you, because I get this question so many times. It's like, oh, there are all these different services. I don't know where to get started and how to use these different services. So I want to take a few minutes and give you what I think is a fairly simple framework and that you can use to think about all the different facets of identity and access in your environment. And then, of course, in each of these pieces, you can drill as deep as you want, and you can get all the capabilities you want. But hopefully, as you walk out of here, this simple framework will sort of set the tone into how you dig deeper into many of these services and how you use many of these services. So this simple framework has essentially 3 components. You can think of them as 3 pillars. You can think of them as 3 layers. I think of them as 3 pillars, simply because how I think about building my application layers out. So the first one is about how do you protect access to your AWS infrastructure itself, right? That's sort of the first layer, is who has access to your AWS accounts and AWS resources like S3 buckets or EC2 resource, EC2 instances or DynamoDB tables. And this is typically your developers or IT pros, right? That's typically the set of users who will have access to manage and create AWS infrastructure. So there are many different scenarios there. For example, how does your developer use AWS CLI to enumerate EC2 instances or create EC2 instances? How does your security ops engineer create a Lambda function to audit the configuration across your accounts? So those are examples of people within your organization that are responsible for managing as well as creating your AWS infrastructure. The next pillar is about the code that is part of your application, right? How does that code access other AWS infrastructure? So typically, you'd be writing an application that's running on EC2 instances or containers or creating Lambda functions. And these pieces of autonomous code has its own identity, and it is accessing DynamoDB tables, or it's accessing S3 buckets, right, or Kinesis streams. And so this autonomous code is also making API calls. So how do you manage identity and access for this autonomous code that's part of your application? So that's pillar number 2. Pillar number 3 is your application itself enabling access to its users, right? So those users could be employees, in which case you want to authenticate them using their corporate identities. These users could be customers, in which case you may be signing them up to and giving them application-specific identity and controlling access using that, right? So there are various scenarios in terms of enabling access to your application itself, okay? So 3 pillars, like who manages the infrastructure and how do you control that? How do you control the access of the code that's part of your application, the autonomous code that needs to access the infrastructure? And then how do you manage access to your application, to the users that need to get access to your application? So those are the 3 things that you should, if you walk out of this session, there's one thing I want you to walk away, is that's it. You want to think about those 3 things. And then figure out, okay, what's your solution for each of those 3 things? And I'll give you some of them right here. So the first one is, okay, how do you want to enable your developers and your IT professionals in your organization to manage their AWS infrastructure, your AWS infrastructure, right? So there are a couple of ways you can do that. The most common and most recommended way would be if you already have your corporate directory, typically Active Directory, or some other SAML-enabled identity directory, then you should federate into AWS, right? The nice thing about that is that your users, your IT pros and developers, can use their corporate credentials when accessing applications as well as when accessing AWS and managing AWS infrastructure, right? Less credentials to manage means generally more security, right? So that it's simpler, it's safer. That way, when hiding and fighting happens inside your organization, those credentials are removed and the access is immediately revoked. So you want to choose to federate into AWS. If that is an option, that's where you want to go. And another nice thing about using SAML-based federation into AWS accounts is that the credentials that they get when they access AWS accounts are fairly short-lived. These are short-lived credentials using the same technology I talked about, IAM roles. And so these credentials expire, right? And the expiry of these credentials is either 1 hour or whatever you choose to configure. By default, it's 1 hour. So they're short-lived credentials, and so the risk of compromise is significantly reduced. You can, of course, if you don't have a corporate directory, you can, of course, use IAM users. IAM does give you user capability as well, and you can, at that point, I'll recommend setting up an IAM password policy, setting up MFA, and other things using IAM, right? So those are your choices. Try to federate in so that you can use IAM more for permissions management and allowing users to use their corporate credentials, or use IAM for users as well as permissions management if you don't have a corporate directory. So fairly simple set of choices for the first pillar, right? Users accessing, your IT pros, your developers accessing and managing AWS infrastructure. And with IAM, you get fairly granular permissions. If you don't know much about permissions, just use the default permission sets we have made available to you. You can use the point-and-click visual editor to customize them and slowly get comfortable with these permissions. And then as your use cases get more sophisticated, you can get fairly granular. The next pillar, right? Your application code, the code that's running on EC2 instance, the code that's running in containers, the code that's running as Lambda functions. How do you give that code access to AWS resources, like DynamoDB tables, S3 buckets? Guess what? very similar, right? You can create IAM roles, attach them to EC2 instances, attach them to containers, attach them to Lambda functions, and you don't have to manage any credentials whatsoever. AWS will automatically plumb new credentials every hour to this autonomous code. And if you're using the AWS SDK, those credentials are automatically plumbed, and your code can just make the API call, and it'll have the right role in which that code will make the call to that API, right? So all you have to now focus on is what permissions you want to grant that code, right? So if you're writing a code that should just have access to the DynamoDB table, you can set up that permission just for that piece of code. If you have another piece of code that does log aggregation and needs to write to S3 bucket, you can just set the permission for that. So again, there really is one choice, right? Use IAM roles so that they get short-term credentials and you can focus on permissions. And these roles work with all of the compute capabilities we have with AWS. So that's the pillar number 2. Pillar number 3, right? Users that are accessing your applications. These could be your customers. These could be your employees accessing some productivity application that you've built. So again, there's one primary choice that we would recommend. Of course, this is an area where you could choose to build it on your own. If you have your own solution that you want to go build, our recommendation would be that you should at least look at Amazon Cognito, especially if you're building scalable customer-facing application where you're expecting to have millions of users signing up and accessing your application. Then Cognito gives you a scalable cloud-native directory which can scale to millions of users. You don't have to worry about scale. You don't have to worry about how you're going to sustain the TPS. And it also takes care of securing the data on disk. It takes care of authentication protocols. It takes care of secure protocols for how your customers reset their credentials, sign up and sign in. So it's a fairly straightforward way of building your application to take advantage of Amazon Cognito. And some of the features that we launched allow you to enhance the security that your customers experience with risk-based adaptive authentication, for example. Right? If you're building an application that is targeting your internal employees, then you have to use whatever your corporate directory. I would recommend using the authentication mechanism provided through your corporate directory. Right? In typical cases, that's Active Directory. And you could do, if you're building it on top of Windows or Linux, you can take advantage of standard Kerberos-based authentication capabilities that are available to you. Right? But if you're building a cloud-native application targeting customers, in many cases, you could build the application targeting your employees using SAML-based authentication. If you're building a SaaS-style application, a web-based application, then Cognito gives you SAML-based inbound authentication as well. So you can allow your employees to authenticate into your application via SAML as well. Right? And if you want to enable Facebook, Twitter, some of the social identities, Cognito gives you those capabilities as well. So if you're building your own application and need to do authentication, you should consider looking at Cognito because it'll solve many of your problems. So to summarize, right, we are very cognizant that each of your journeys is unique, right? Your needs are unique. What you want to go build has its own characteristics. Your constraints are different. So that's why we provide you lots of tools in the toolbox that you can take advantage of to solve your specific problems. We want you to help you build applications that clearly are more secure than the AWS Cloud. We don't want you to embed credentials in your application. Please use short-term credentials because that will make your applications more secure, as an example. Right? So there are many other sessions that you can go to, right, to dive deep into many of the things I talked about. There are also sort of follow-ups we can do if you want to kind of meet me. We have some time. I'm happy to actually take questions, even though I don't think I was expected to take questions, but I'm happy to take questions because we have some time left. And then we'll have a page available later today that actually sort of summarizes the session and specifically the 3 pillars, the mental model I talked about in terms of how you should think about the different facets of identity and authentication and access control for your application. Happy to take questions. Anybody? Oh, go ahead.
So how would you go about doing role-based access inside of Kubernetes type servers? How would you go about doing roles within Kubernetes where you don't want to extend a role permission to any pod within the Kubernetes cluster? You want to isolate it down to a particular pod.
So this is, when you say role-based access, this is for users that are going to authenticate, or?
For the application talking to any API service within Amazon.
Within Amazon? So you can, I don't know specifically about Kubernetes, but Kubernetes is just running containers. And so you can assign IAM roles to those containers. And once you assign IAM roles, those credentials are automatically populated. And then you can grant permissions, right? So these are IAM roles. So it is sort of role-based access control where it will get a specific role with a set of permissions that.
I'd be interested in hearing about do you have any plans around using user-based certificates like PKI-based X509 certificates specifically for user access?
So your question is, do we have any plans for enabling certificate-based authentication for users? So this is client authentication, like SSL client auth. Client and service accounts. So we've not specifically created any plans around that. So I'd love to understand your use case of what you're trying to solve. Most of the certificate-based authentication capabilities we have are server authentication type scenarios where, TLS kind of scenarios. We've not had specific asks around client certificates per se. Now, there are things we are doing in the context of multi-factor auth use cases where you have tokens, and a lot of these tokens tend to have cryptographic keys on them. So you're sort of getting PKI style authentication, but it's not the traditional TLS client auth, right? So if that helps answer your question.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the risk-based authentication, and particularly the number that you get out. What is the risk level? Is it like 1 to 10? Is it some number we'll understand? How do we know how to adjust that so we don't get too many false positives?
That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head what sort of the score range is. So if I remember, I think it is between up to 100. I think the score is 100, but don't quote me on that. And it's a good question in terms of how you adjust it, right? So you'll have to play around a little bit because it's a use case driven situation. We do provide you some guidelines if you go read up the documentation around where those trigger points are. Right, what are the different contexts we are taking advantage of in terms of location, in terms of time of day, multiple authentications. So it'll give a certain risk score, so you can essentially, on your own terms, evaluate what you're comfortable with, right, to set that score. It does require some tuning, though, for your use case. So your question is, do we have RBA for B2E services? When you say B2E services, what do you mean?
Right, so you have it for, if I'm setting up a set of services for consumers, not incognito, for my internal employees, it's a different use case than consumers, because it requires more scale. Is the RBA available outside of Cognito?
So you can use Cognito for your B2E use case, especially if you're if you're doing SAML-based authentication of your employees. And at that point, RBA will be available to you. Is that a different way you're authenticating? So the question is, how are you authenticating your employees?
With using multi-factor authentication, like, so we have, so we're trying to establish different levels, different methods of authentication, depending on the sensitivity of the app and behavior of the user.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, can you profile behaviors of employees over time based upon the sensitivity of the app, pick the appropriate authentication?
I can't imagine how we would give you an RBA without also sort of doing the authentication, right? It's so much wired into the authentication system. Like we are exploring enabling RBA for authenticating to AWS, right? Through AWS sign-in capabilities. But that doesn't necessarily meet your needs. Cognito would be our answer for using, even if you're doing SAML-based authentication, right? It's sort of wired into the authentication protocol. Yeah.
Are you guys using naive Bayesian methods for determining the risk levels?
I wouldn't know that answer to that question. But Arturo, do you know? Go ahead. Sorry. So two questions, right? So let me kind of paraphrase those questions. So one question is, how flexible is the RBA capability, risk-based authentication capability, where you, as part of the authentication, you can make a call out, say to a Lambda function, right, to go do additional validation before you succeed the call. So that's one piece. The other piece is, within the application logic, when the application logic is running where the user is downloading hundreds of gigabytes of data, right, can you subsequently trigger the risk base, right? So the answer to the first one, I believe, is yes, right? You can customize it because Cognito generally supports kind of plugging in your adapters, if you will. The second question, at that point, the logic is in your code, right? I don't know how we intercept that logic. At that point, you can call the same adapters that you're running, right? Because only you know that something strange is happening at that point because it's part of your application logic. Go ahead.
I want to bring up a break glass accounts. What's your golden rule? Do you agree federation or do you local? If it's local, do you have supported by a hard token or by soft?
Sorry, what's the context?
This is the break glass accounts.
Break glass accounts.
Right. Because you're going to have a couple of accounts as a break glass. Something federation goes down, for example. You need to add a backdoor or whatever key or master key you want to call.
Uh-huh.
Add those accounts to basically, fix the federation result.
So this is, you are running a federation server. I'm just trying to understand. So you're running a federation server, and it's running in some account, AWS account, right? Or running with some identity. And it goes down, so you need to go fix that. The master key. So we typically tell you that for root accounts, on root users on all AWS accounts, you should protect them with MFA, right? You should absolutely, and you should secure that MFA away, right, into a box so that.
The question is not securing that, but the golden rule is you need to be a local account, AWS only, not federated account, using the root account anymore, or use MFA, download tokens like physical tokens. What's your golden rule?
The golden rule is you should use physical tokens for protecting the break glass account, right?
Adding a 2% rule.
Ideally, a two-person rule. 2% rule becomes hard because we today, at least in AWS, don't give you 2 keys to authenticate.
I mean, like the password and
Yes, you can have the password in one person's control and the MFA key in the other person's control. Go ahead.
Any reasons why the number of attached policies are kept to 10?
So the question is, what is the reason why we keep the attached policies to principals to 10?
Yeah, and any chance of
We increased that number to 20 recently. So, but the question is still valid. So there are a couple of technical reasons. One of the reasons is that AWS IAM has to scale to millions of customers and millions of customer needs, right? So what happens is that when we authenticate the requests, you can imagine we're authenticating trillions of requests coming in for every single API call across AWS. And these decisions have to be done in milliseconds, right? Sub-milliseconds in cases, right, if you're making calls. And if we allow the policies to get too large, the latency on these calls is going to go up, right? So one of them is just a fundamental constraint on how do we ensure that our APIs authenticate and authorize access very, very quickly. Like, imagine DynamoDB call taking several milliseconds to complete, right? So that puts some real constraints for us in terms of how much we allow. So every time we increase those limits on a per principal basis, we have to do extensive testing to make sure that we don't create a latency issue for all of AWS APIs, right? So that's a primary constraint. And so we've been increasing those limits as the Moore's law allows for more compute capability and more scale out, right, for us. So sorry, can you? Yeah.
So if we reach to like a limit on any role or any other IAM object, what is the recommendation? We should split it out, or how we should proceed with that?
Yeah, I would. So that's a good question. So I would ask the question: why do you have a principal that needs too many permissions, right? And if it does, right, how do you sort of consolidate those permissions in ways? By the way, you can use the forum to reach out to us. If you want to share your JSON files, we're happy to make recommendations on how you can actually shrink the policies. Yeah, usually what we find is that there must be something going wrong in terms of how you're setting up your policy, where you are maybe granting too many things, right, or being too granular in some cases and causing the policies to explode. Right? Usually we are able to, wherever we run into those cases, usually we are able to help you, right, either factor the policies up in such a way that you don't have that problem. Go ahead.
Currently, there's like kind of different levels of granularity you can have with IAM policies. For example, S3 has resource-based policies, and then there's resource level, and then I guess service level is what I call them. Is there any plan to support more resource-based policies? So like you can do very granular control for S3, but not the same for DynamoDB and a lot of other services. What are the plans about maybe adding those in the future? Is that planned?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually a valid criticism, I'll sort of say. We hear that from customers. The way AWS is organized and the way we operate is while my teams provide a common set of services like authentication and authorization, every AWS service is independently making decisions about what features and what capability they want to support. Of course, we go after them to make sure they are consistent, but at the end of the day, they make decisions about whether they want to support resource level permissions or not, because they have to do work on their side. And some of our more mature services, like S3, have seen customers make requests that they want granular policies, and they go do the work and they support those policies. Some of our newer services haven't yet sort of heard those requirements, and they've chosen not to add those capabilities, and they may over time, right? One of the things we are looking at starting next year is how do we drive consistency across AWS services so that they're consistently supporting a set of features like resource-based policies. But it is an effort that we have to drive with all of AWS service teams because they are independent owners of their businesses and they make those decisions. So you should provide that feedback to the services that you would like to see, and then we will help push your case with those service teams.
How does the command line work with federation? So, like, when you talk about a bunch of different authorization types and applications, how does the command line play at all?
So with command line, so what you can do is you can get a short-term credential and pass it to the command line. It's just another access key, secret key.
Like, so, like, authorization for the command line itself, can you use federation as part of that, or does that require, like, access direct through Amazon?
Maybe I'm not understanding your question. So the command line is just think of it as a command shell, right, that makes API calls.
Yeah, but it has a whole bunch of enhanced features, right? That are based upon your credentials, you can have all sorts of advanced things that happen in the Amazon command line, right?
The command line just is essentially an API invoker for you, right? And so it sets up the context using the credentials you provide to it, and after that you make calls, right? And you can make so it sort of uses the SDK underneath to make the API calls.
And so the thing I'm getting pushback on is around using federation causes issues with the command line. Using command line.
I'd love to know more what the issues are. So if you have specific things, you can definitely send us feedback, right? And I do know of one limitation we do have in the command line where for federation specifically, that the credentials are only valid for an hour, whereas we've done the work on the console side, where if your federation system gives us a SAML token with 12-hour life, then that session will stay alive for 12 hours. That is not true with the console today, with the command line today, and that is the work we are planning to do. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just kind of expand on that. So if you're on-prem and running the CLI, and you want to access, let's say, S3 and pull some data in, but you don't want to give out long-term credentials, what's the recommended workflow so that users on-prem interact with S3 and get temporary credentials in a frictionless way?
Oh, so your federation, whatever is your federation proxy, will have to sort of make the assume role call and give you the short-term credentials, if that makes sense, right? So I don't know your specific scenario. If you do have a federation proxy that users can use their corporate credentials to access, and then it issues them a short-term credential that they can use with the CLI. That's when you say automated, how would you like to see that automated?
They just are on their own computer and type the CLI and some sort of SSO works.
Oh, is this for, so what you can do is, typically what you'll have is some sort of a web page that your federation proxy supports, right? For the users to use their corporate credentials to log in. And then from there, you could support sort of an invocation of the CLI with the credentials plumbed, right? I've seen some customers do that where essentially it'll fork a session, right? A command session, and then it's got the credentials plumbed. It's good for an hour. So you can do things like that, right? Because it is on their client, it's on their desktop, right? And the browser. So that's one of the ways you can do that. Go ahead. Risk-based factors? Sorry, I didn't get. It's already built into Cognito. So if you use the built-in sign-in and sign-up pages, it will automatically do that for you. Yeah, right. If you decide to just use the API, Cognito API, and have your own sign-up and sign-in page, then the API will return you parameters that you can then use to and create that experience. Cool. We ended up using all the time. Thank you, guys.